It's a difficult one. Where do we draw a line between recreational and medical? I think certainly in Europe, and you see it in terms of how we're approaching it, as opposed to North Americans, it's much more conservative, and there's a real fear around any kind of perceived enjoyment out of this plant or substance, and if it's remotely enjoyable, then that's recreational. It almost has to taste bad for it to be a medicine, I think is the vibe that I get from this. And I think it's a bit misleading, particularly now when we have things like anxiety and stresses, two of the major factors in our society that are causing illness. Yeah, our Western medical system is very based on a pharmaceutical model, and big pharmaceutical companies produce drugs at large expense, and they want a return on that investment. And so our model has been skewed towards this type of medication, and plant and cannabis-based medicines don't fit very well into that, which is quite difficult for those companies. And they have vast amounts of money which they spend on marketing and all of these kinds of things. And this is something that the cannabis industry currently doesn't have. I mean, effectively, it would be quite scary if you can grow your own medicine. Because effectively you could grow a plant, and then you could extract oils, you could vape it, you could make it into tinctures, you can make it into creams for topical application, and you could effectively grow something that will solve a lot of your problems, and no one's making any money out of that. And I mean, like it or not, we live in a very capitalist society, and that is generally how things get done. So this really challenges that in a number of ways, and I think that's probably a large part to do with how this thing is evolving and how it will evolve. My name's Anuj Desai. I am a lawyer and a podcaster. Firstly a lawyer for the last 15 years, and then the last couple of years I host a weekly podcast on the European cannabis industry, which covers CBD, medical cannabis and hemp. So I grew up in North London and have lived in London for all my life. I am a lawyer, so I've been doing that for the last 15 years. And I got involved in the cannabis space in about 3 years ago, initially as a kind of early stage investor, but more just sort of finding out more about what was going on. I bumped into an old colleague of mine who is quite active and has a couple of businesses in this area. And he invited me along to a brilliant conference called Cannabis Europe, which was in the Barbican. And I went, and I didn't really know what to expect. I'd heard a little bit about the medical side of things, but I wasn't sure what I'd get. A bunch of hippies or some activists or whatever. I wasn't sure what I was getting myself into, and I found it incredible. And actually the session that really blew me away was the one with the medical patients. There was Charlotte Caldwell, who's mother of Billy Caldwell, who helped change the law in the UK. But there were other people with different conditions ranging from chronic pain to MS to other forms of epilepsy. And they were all told their stories about how they've been using cannabis as a treatment for their ailments. And it was so moving and so profound that it completely changed my idea on what was actually happening here. And I felt really quite aggrieved that they were having to fight for this. This was actually prior to the changing of the law, so it was at the time still relatively contentious, and it is still a bit contentious today actually. But that really stimulated me to look into this area a bit more, and I started to learn about more what was happening in the States and in Canada and actually Israel and Uruguay and various parts of the world, and I realised actually this is quite a global reawakening, if you like. And I was like, I want to be part of this. Where are we now? I would say we're really, really early. And that keeps being brought home to me on a daily basis because I'm surrounded by it. But even in the US and in Canada, they're really early. I mean, in the US, it's legal to varying degrees in various states, but it's still federally illegal, which is a massive problem. And it's also Schedule 1 controlled substance, so it's at the same level as heroin and above crystal meth and cocaine, crazily. And so look, there's lots to happen, and the difficulty is that everyone's doing it in a slightly different way. Every country is adopting a slightly different attitude, and what that causes is a lack of harmonisation. So those cause barriers between people sort of doing business together, and hopefully they're getting smoothed out. But there is there's quite a lot of work to do still. At the UN level, there's some issues in terms of how they're treating cannabis and even CBD, and there's lots of disagreements on how to approach these things. So I think there is definitely no consensus across the world in terms of how to deal with it, which is in turn making governments uncomfortable about making bold decisions. I mean, the Canadians, Trudeau made a very bold decision in deciding to legalise adult use cannabis, but they've experienced a lot of problems in how they've gone about that. And in a way, I kind of hope that they and California, who also legalised a few years ago, are sort of serving as lessons for everyone to look at and to see these things worked and these things didn't. And if I'm being optimistic, I hope that governments are looking at it and seeing, well, let's see 2-3 years worth of data from those guys, see what worked and where we can kind of pick up from, and then they've got a model they can use, and it's easier to sell that into your electorate than making it completely from scratch. I definitely think the perception and the attitude is changing. I don't know whether it's fully there yet if you ask such a big question, but I think that there is a lot of fear, and the fear is bred by ignorance, and there is a real assumption that cannabis is smoking in dingy places, and this kind of is the only way that you interact with it, and it's just one substance and that's it. And there really isn't any appreciation of the fact that there's thousands of varieties potentially, and hundreds of compounds within the plant, and actually there's loads of different methods of delivery as well. And if you're putting it into a tincture or a tablet, those are much more understandable concepts to patients and people who have never had any dealings with cannabis at all. And that is all, in order to further that, basically need more education so people can understand, and that helps to break down fears and then the ignorance. What I would say is I think that older people are starting to look at this in a more healthy way, because ultimately, as you get on in your life and you're looking for ways that will help you feel better or relieve your symptoms of whatever ailments that you get, which inevitably you get with older age, and you're slightly open to new things if you think it can help you. And I think if you're getting those people who you'd normally assume to be quite more conservative, who are mellowing in their attitude towards it, that also really helps. The way that you get this in front of the general public is you need money. There needs to be quite a big lobbying campaign. The PR campaign around the Billy Caldwell case was brilliantly executed and really necessary to highlight the injustice here that people aren't getting these medicines, and actually a sick child has been generally the way that these things have changed across the world in different countries, because it's very hard to argue with. If you have adult patients that are suffering, that are using it, there is less sympathy and less understanding. But if you've got a child that's suffering and you've got the pleas of a mother that's distraught at the fact that she can't give her child medicine without breaking the law, you realise the insanity of the issue. But this needs to be constantly pushed, and that does cost money, unfortunately. You do see mainstream press mellowing a bit on this as well, though. A few years ago the Daily Mail would never have run anything other than negative stories about cannabis, but it is now separating medical cannabis from recreational cannabis. It still obviously treats recreational cannabis in probably a similar way, but there are more positive stories around the medical benefits of cannabis, and really need to capitalise on that but it needs money, unfortunately, to really push home that agenda. And it also needs to be lobbying at a government level as well. And I think as the industry becomes more sophisticated, there will be budgets that are allocated towards that. But at the moment, I think everyone's just sort of trying to keep their head above water. So that kind of cash is probably not sectioned off for those purposes. I think there's a huge opportunity here for this plant, not just this plant actually, but many different plants, I think, to have a bigger influence on our society, cannabis in particular, from a medicinal purpose, but also from an environmental purpose, in terms of how it's grown and its fantastic sustainable credentials in terms of CO2 sequestration and phytoremediation of soil and various other things that it's amazing for. I think it can be really, really valuable in terms of tackling the climate issues that we have. But in terms of medicine, I think there's huge amounts of applications, and it's just at the beginning at the moment. Unfortunately, I think cannabis is, largely because of THC and the intoxicating nature of it, is treated in a different way to many other drugs. We tolerate pharmaceutical drugs that have, very sketchy efficacy and huge amounts of side effects, and these are prescribed on a daily basis. Hydrocortisone is one of them, a steroid cream, which if you have any skin issue, it's automatically prescribed when you go to a doctor, or in my experience, and those are my friends. It's rare that doctors have time to figure out why you have a rash on, what's causing that. Here's something to just deal with that. And it's a steroid cream, and lots of people have withdrawal issues from using that. So that's just one example of something that we use, it's openly prescribed, but it has lots of issues. So when people criticize cannabis for not, there's not enough research, or it's not this perfect solution to things, we have many imperfect solutions that we live with every single day. And that's just part of how we live. So I think we need to modify how we look at those sort of areas. So I started the Cannabis Conversation mainly because, as I said, I wanted to do something in this space, but I really didn't know what. And actually, it's quite early, so I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to focus my attentions. So I thought the best way to do that is just go out and learn and meet some people. And everyone wants to talk because it's so early. That I thought a podcast would be a good way. There were a few going on in North America, but no one was really doing it in Europe. Now there are a few more, but at the time I think it was one of the earlier ones, and it was fantastic. I got a great opportunity to meet some real thought leaders. Started off in the UK and in Europe, but now I'm interviewing people in North America quite regularly, and it's fascinating. And at the beginning I was worried that I'd probably just end up interviewing a lot of CBD entrepreneurs who were trying to sell their products. But actually, the more I learn, the more I realise that how much more there is to learn, and it's a huge topic. The highlights are probably Professor Raphael Mechoulam, who's known as the godfather of cannabis research. He discovered or elucidated the structure of THC and CBD, and the two endocannabinoids, 2-AG and anandamide, and effectively uncovered the endocannabinoid system to the world. And he discovered THC and CBD back in the 60s, so that sort of tells you how far back this goes. But he's about to turn 90 and is sharp as a tack, and is still now researching some other cannabinoids and doing some incredible work, which is quite inspiring actually. I've also interviewed Dr. Ethan Russo, who's a very revered scholar in the US, and is a key researcher looking at various types of aspects of the plant. Dr. Rachel Knox, who is a endocannabinoid specialist, and she, in that interview, gave a brilliant description of how the endocannabinoid system works and how it keeps you in balance. And I'm not going to butcher it here with my unscientific recollection of it, but it was fascinating. Cannabis Conversation is available on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, and a few other podcast providers, as well as YouTube. The website is cannabis-conversation.com, and I've got a few social media profiles which you can find me on, so please come and have a listen if you want to learn more about the industry and hear for some interesting people who were working in this space.
My name is Sam Cannon and I am the founder of Beyond Green. On the 2nd and 3rd of December this year, the UN will vote on the World Health Organization's recommendation on the rescheduling of cannabis. This is a mammoth moment in time. Please like, comment and share these videos so that the truth can be told and that the planet and everybody on it can benefit from this truly, truly incredible plant once again. Thank you.